And she decided that that the people in Afghanistan were being ridden roughshod by the Russians, and so she single-handedly convinced a pliable Texas Democratic senator named Charlie Wilson to push really hard. This is the way that the United States beat the Russians in the 1980s. We just bled them white. And all of this kind of came from this woman who was behind the scenes pulling strings and arranging things. And that is very much the picture of what we have this morning. We're going to read one of the most interesting stories, I believe, in the Old Testament. It is the story of the only female judge in Israel's history, a woman named Deborah, and how she rescued God's people. As you guys know, we've been going through the book of Judges, and we have been looking at this story of God's people falling into rebellion and rejection of God, and how they'll reject God and they'll worship false gods, and then God will punish them, and then they'll cry out to God, and then he brings a restorer to them. But every time he brings a restorer, the person is a little different. It's not the traditional hero. We've seen how God used a kind of a crippled man to save Israel. We've seen how God has used a foreign mercenary to save Israel. And now we're going to see this kind of weird familial relationship between Deborah and Barak, and how he's going to use this kind of strained relationship and this upended order to save Israel. Our story begins this morning in verse 1 of chapter 4. And the people have yet again abandoned God. We read, again, the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord. If you guys remember, last time there was about 40 years between when Ehud, the left-handed man, had kind of destroyed Israel's oppressors. And now Israel's oppressors have risen up again. This time they're a little bit different. We read that after Ehud had died, the Lord sold them into the hands of Jabin, king of Canaan, who reigned in Hazor, Sisera. The commander of his armies was based at Hashareth Hagoyim. And because he had 900 chariots fitted with iron and had cruelly oppressed Israel for 20 years, they cried out to the Lord for help. And so we see now the picture. Before, we had a ruler who is in Jericho, kind of out in the eastern desert. Now the story shifts north to Jabin, who ruled in a place called Hazor. Now, Jabin, again, is not his name. We think Jabin is probably what they called their king. The reason we think this is because a generation before, Joshua had killed Jabin, king of Hazor. Okay? So I want you to think the conquest had happened. They had gone to this major fortress city. Hazor is and still remains the largest fortress city in Israel. Like, you can go to Israel now, and it is still the largest ruined complex of buildings. It's on this hill, and it overlooks the major trade routes from Syria into Egypt. It's an incredibly powerful place. And Joshua had defeated them. But now Jabin, a new Jabin, has come into Hazor, this fortress city. He's rebuilt it, and he is using it to control all of northern Israel. But see, he's done something else. He has united all of Israel's opponents against them, including a man named Sisera. Now, Sisera is not a Canaanite. We think Sisera is probably one of those Philistines that we had talked about 2 weeks ago, right? These are the sea peoples, maybe Greeks, people from off of the island of Crete who were technologically advanced, who had strong armor and had iron. And we're told here that Sisera was down in the Jezreel Valley. This is one of the major agricultural areas of southern Israel. It's a large, flat plain. It's perfect ground for chariots. And so Sisera has what is the equivalent of tanks on this big open field. And so Jabin has allied with Sisera, and between the two of them, they've put Israel between a rock and a hard place. They're able to control all of Israel's trade and most of their agriculture. They're able to subject Israel. The situation, though, is not the product of geopolitics. It's the product of sin and rebellion on the part of Israel. Once again, Israel has forgotten their God. Not 40 years after Israel had been released by Ehud, as they'd had this major victory, Israel has once again forgotten who their God is and turned to other gods to worship them. And once again, Israel has been sold into the hand of evil people. It's important that we understand as we read this that when we abandon God, He allows us to be hurt. Now, nobody likes being hurt. In fact, much of the Old Testament is God's people trying to wrestle with why a good God is allowing them to suffer. We call this the problem of theodicy. Why a good God allows evil to happen. Over and over again, God's people are going to cry out, "Why, O Lord, are you allowing this to happen to me?" And often the answer is, because you made really bad choices. You worshiped false gods. Why is God allowing this to happen to you? Well, because He told you, if you worship false gods and turn away from me, bad things will happen. I have a saying that many of you have heard. Everything happens for a reason. Sometimes the reason is you're stupid and you make bad choices. I have a little picture on my wall. It's a picture of a seagull that has a nest in the middle of railroad tracks that are coming together, and it says, why do bad things happen to me? And also, the decisions that I make. See, often, God will allow bad things to happen to us because He loves your character far more than He loves your comfort. If you are one of God's children, He cares far more about your character than He does about your comfort. That means that He's going to allow bad things to happen to you in order to purge away the defects in your character. All Christians will at one time or another endure hardship. Because God's number one concern isn't your comfort. He's not Santa Claus. He's not a senile old grandfather who just wants you to come and hang out with Him, and He'll buy you a pony if you do. He gives special blessings to His people because they glorify Him, but He also allows His people to be afflicted and to suffer in order to purify them. So we got a couple of different kind of fires that we're going to go through. When we have bad things happening to us, sometimes those are perfecting fires, okay? Sometimes bad things happen to us. God allows bad things to happen to us because it drives us closer to Him. He allows the effects of an evil world, disease, crime, war, bad weather, all of those things. He allows those things to affect us, to drive us closer into relationship with Him, and to show us what it means to live in a fallen world. Those are perfecting fires. But sometimes we are suffering as the direct result of our own sin. You have sinned, and sin has consequences. If you cheat on your wife, she's not going to trust you. I have this conversation so often with people. We're doing marriage counseling. They're like, well, I apologize. Like, yeah, but you still cheated on your wife, man. Guess what? You're going to pay for that for a long, long, long time. Not because you're being oppressed, but because sin has consequences. If you break the law, you may go to jail. Listen, if you get pulled over at a traffic stop, and the cop asks you to get out of the car, and you don't get out of the car, and you fight the cop, and you hit the cop, and the cop handcuffs you and throws you in jail, you're not being persecuted as a Christian. You're being arrested as a jerk. Sometimes sin has consequences. And oftentimes we're angry because God allows us to suffer the consequences of those actions. Oh God, why did you allow me to fail that test? Well, oh, Son of Man, you didn't study for that test. This isn't persecution, it's cause and effect. And what you need to understand is that the pain that you are enduring is not a sign that God no longer loves you or that God is no longer in control. It's a sign that God is allowing the consequences of your sin to teach you not to sin again. And sometimes the consequences can be catastrophic. Sometimes our sin costs us our families, our freedom. Sometimes our sin costs us our lives. This is not a sign that God is not in control. It is a sign that God is teaching us what he wants us to know. You need to understand this. When we cease glorifying God, when we treat God as an afterthought, he brings us back into relationship with him, oftentimes through trial and pain. But we need to understand this. This is not God condemning us or punishing us. There is no condemnation in Christ Jesus. This is God allowing us to suffer the consequences of our actions. And very often, in his grace and his mercy, those consequences are far less than what they should be. I remember grading papers one time, and one of my students came to me and he goes, "Oh, well, I got a D. What do you call this?" And I was like, "I call it grace because your paper was terrible and you should have failed." So often, the consequences that we reap are so far less than what we deserve. And Israel is no different. Israel has been spitting in the face of God now for almost 100 years, and God has continued to preserve them. And now he's going to preserve them again. But he's going to preserve them in a way that is in its own way an act of judgment. We read in verse 4, "Now Deborah, a prophet, the wife of Libbadeth, was leading Israel at the time." Now I want to stop for a second right there. That in and of itself is a bizarre statement for the Bible. Number one, Deborah is a woman, and she's a prophet, and she's leading Israel. That doesn't happen. The priests are the ones that are supposed to speak to God, are supposed to speak to the people for God, and are supposed to speak to God for the people. They're the ones that are supposed to intercede. And yet right now, what we can take from this is that the priests, once again, have become so ineffectual that God has to go outside of the normal priestly lines to be able to speak to his people. And he has raised up not a man. He didn't go to Libbadeth and say, "Hey man, I need you to talk for me." No, he goes to Libbadeth's wife. And he goes to a woman named Deborah. And my understanding is that the word Deborah means something like honeybee or sweetie pie. It's something that's like really nice. It's that kind of like north. And this is why I think about the woman from Charlie Wilson's War, because the woman from Charlie Wilson's War is this slow-speaking Southern drawl woman who is very sweet but has a fist of iron, and that's kind of who Deborah is. Deborah has this really sweet-sounding name, like, "Oh, it's the honeybee. The old honeybee is up there underneath the tree, judging between the tribes." This is a normal woman from the tribe of Ephraim who has been anointed by God to bring his word to his people. She sits near the priests of Bethel, and the people come to hear God's will from her because the Levitical priesthood is ineffectual. This is important for us to understand because often we look at this and people use this as a reason why women can have leadership roles in the church. They say, "Well, look at Deborah. Well, this is why the whole idea of male headship in the church and male headship in the family is a lie because of Deborah." But Deborah, you need to understand, is the exception that proves the rule. Deborah is a sign of God's judgment on his people. God is in effect saying, there is no man in Israel who is capable of receiving my word, and so you will receive God's word from a woman as a sign of judgment on you. She is sitting beneath the palm trees and mediating between the tribes. But what we need to understand is that she does not see herself as Xena the warrior queen. I just dated myself again because half of y'all don't know who that is. Don't watch that. It's a terrible show. It's really bad. In fact, later on in the Song of Deborah, you know what she's going to refer to herself as? The mother of Israel. She is a mother doing what mothers do. When their boy children are acting up, she establishes order between them. She says, y'all ain't going to act like grown folks. You're going to have your mom tell you what to do. Let old honeybee sit under the tree and tell you how it's going to be. But this woman has authority. She has authority in that she can call Barak from the town, and that her word, she can muster 10,000 men to follow him. It's also a woman who has been raised up by God to lead Israel, is the only judge that is depicted positive terms. She poses a clear break with the judge, appears on the scene and then disappears. She doesn't grasp her kingship. Deborah again until Samuel, hundreds and hundreds of years later. Deborah, the prophet, the judge, is not a new model for godly leadership. She is the ultimate condemnation of Hebrew manhood. We need to understand this, that when the breakdown in God-ordained gender roles happens, it is caused and a sign of God's judgment on his people. God has a very clear design for how he wants the family and the church to be run. From the very beginning, he established male headship. Now understand this. Every time we talk about this kind of thing, people start getting bent out of shape. That's right. I'll get letters later on. Male headship does not mean that men are better than women. It simply means that men and women are different. Now, I know I have to tell you guys this because we live in a culture that has taught us either that men and women are the same, or that women are better than men, or anatomy. There's men, and there's women. And they're different. Here, because this is family service, okay? God created us different. We are both equally made in the image of goals. Okay? Doesn't mean one role is better than the other, but we have different spheres. Church. That doesn't mean that men have to do everything in the church. It does mean that men do have to do some stuff in the church. And that men have been given leadership in their families. It doesn't mean that men get to sit in their easy chair while their women serve them. It means that men are responsible for caring for their family and leading their families. Now, understand this. You can delegate your authority, abrogate your responsibility. You can give all of your authority away in this church and in your family, but you are still going to be held responsible before God for what happens in your family and for what happens in this church. Brothers and sisters, so often when we step outside of God's ordained purposes, we take our burdens and we lay them on the weakest members among us. Women rule our families because men have given up. Women don't set out to rule their families, but they are betrayed and let down by husbands. Rise to the occasion. I want to encourage you now, yelling at women and saying, get back in your place. No, for some, like the men of Israel at this time have run away. I want you to think about this. Later on in the Song of Deborah, she'll talk about how there are no spears and no shields in all of Israel. The fighting men of Israel, men who were supposed to protect their families and their communities against those who would fight against them, have all run away. And in our families, that's what happens so often. Instead of leading our families spiritually, men retreat to sports or hobbies or work. And they leave wives and children to the tender mercies of the world. And so I just want to take a moment right now and I want to encourage you guys. Stand up. Be a man. Not by yelling at your wives or ordering your wives around, but by leading your families well. What does this look like? Well, let me tell you what it looks like. It's other things above your spiritual life. If you're putting sports or your job or your school or your relationship with your friends or alcohol or tobacco or whatever else, put that aside. Because leading a family isn't an easy thing. Get into your word. Spend time with other men that can nurture you and disciple you. And then begin to lead your family by your example. And ladies, I want to encourage you. So many times women will come to me and say, oh, I wish my husband would lead our family. I wish my husband would lead our family. Why doesn't my husband lead our family? And I'm like, because every time he tries, you shut him down. Don't make fun of your husbands. Build them up. If they're trying to lead and they're not doing it right and they're messing it up, you're not going to criticize them into being better. Pray for them and follow their leadership as much as you can. And guys, that goes the same in the church. See, as the family goes, so goes the church. And so often we find churches where the majority of the people in the church are women. Now that happens for a couple of different reasons. Sometimes it's because women come to Christ more than men. Sometimes it's because women marry men that aren't Christians. And so you end up with a church that is made up of more women than men, and the men that are in the church abrogate their responsibility. Brothers and sisters, it is so easy for women to run a church, and yet it is so destructive when it happens. If you are a man in this church, I want to encourage you, as I am encouraging you to step up in prayer to lead your family, I want to encourage you to step up prayerfully to lead this church. Not by demanding your way, not by criticizing the people that are doing things, but by stepping into service as deacons, by stepping into service as Sunday school teachers and Bible study teachers. This is what leadership looks like in the church. It looks like service. And I want to encourage you to do that. See, because when we step outside of God's will, everything begins to fall apart. But that doesn't mean that God has left his church or his people or his families. And we're going to see what happens as God restores Israel. But he's going to restore them in a way that brings them no glory. See, despite the total rebellion of God, the total rebellion of his people, God still raises up a hero. But even this hero is enmeshed in complex stuff. God calls on Barak. We read that Deborah called for a man named Barak, and Barak means the lightning bolt. And that's a cool name, right? Barak the lightning bolt. Yeah. Captain Lightning. That's what I'm going to call him from now on. Captain Lightning. Deborah calls on Barak, Captain Lightning Bolt, and that he's going to give Sisera into his hands. And what does Barak do? This manly man says, I'll go if you come with me. So Barak the lightning bolt says to Deborah the honeybee, hey, I need you to come with me. Now, it sounds kind of flattering on the surface, like, well, I really need you with me. But really what he's doing is he's using Deborah as insurance. He's figuring in his mind, if I have Deborah with me, then God will have to come through because this is the prophet. God will lead the army of Jabin to the Kishon River and defeat them for Barak. That's the promise, and so he wants to get Deborah to go with him. But see, Deborah understands exactly what he's saying, and she sees right through it, and she declares to him that God will still gain the victory, but he will give it to the glory of a woman. And so everything happens the way that God has called it. Naphtali assembles at Mount Tabor. Naphtali is a tribe, and so Barak the lightning bolt goes up there, and he grabs 10,000 other men, and he says, we're going to go down to the Jezreel Valley, and we're going to go fight some chariots on foot. And they're like, seriously? And he's like, yeah, it's going to work. It's going to be great. Trust me. So they all follow him. They go down there, and something amazing happens. I want you to imagine this. A chariot, like they would have at the time, would probably have 2 to 4 wheels. It's driven by 2 horses. There would be a guy driving the chariot and another guy with spears. And the chariot could break an enemy line in a couple of different ways. They would either ride up real close and throw their javelins and shoot their arrows and then ride off, or they would just ride up really hard and run over people. Either way, if you were dismounted and you were facing chariots, it was a bad day for you. And so Naphtali has kind of lined up on this hill crest, and they're looking down over the Jezreel Valley, and they can look out and they can see the enemy chariots out there laid out. And Barak says, okay, now we need to advance into the valley. We need to come down off of this hill, and we need to advance about 9 miles towards the river. And they have the faith to do it. So they start walking down, and they start kind of staying in formation. They start picking up to a run, and they start advancing at a run towards the chariots, and the chariots look out, and they're like, oh, easy day. Easy day. So here come the chariots, and they come across the Jezreel Valley, and they go down into the river to cross, and it's a pretty easy crossing. And just as they're about to cross the river, something amazing happens. We read from the Song of Deborah that God opened up the heavens and there was a cloud burst. And as so often happens, anybody that's ever been in the desert knows, when it rains hard upriver, a wall of water comes down. And it may seem a little bit fantastical, but I've been in the desert when the water's picked up a tank, a 60-ton tank, flipped it end over end down the valley. So this wall of water comes down and just washes all of Israel's enemies away. We read in Judges 5:20, from the heavens the stars fought, and from their courses they fought against Sisera. The river Kishon swept them all away. The age-old river, the river Kishon, march on, my soul, be strong. Then thundered the horses' hooves, galloping, galloping, go to his mighty steeds. In a single stroke, God has destroyed the mighty army of Jabin and left Sisera unhorsed and helpless. Now is the moment when Barak should have glory. Sisera runs away as hard and as fast as he can. And Deborah looks at Barak and says, okay, go kill him. Because she's pretty hard. Honeybee got a sting on her. She says, go kill him. Let's end this thing. And so Barak goes and tries to run him down. And as Sisera runs, he escapes to the camp of one of his master's allies. Now, here's one of these kind of reoccurring themes that we have in Judges. He goes to the tent of Habar the Canaanite. And as I was studying this, I saw the Canaanites show up over and over and over again. At every major kind of junction in the book of Judges, the Canaanites are there. The Canaanites are the in-laws of Moses that have kind of tagged along. They're kind of a tribal herding people. They live in tents. And this particular group has allied themselves with the enemy. And so Sisera goes into the tent of Habar the Canaanite, but Habar isn't there. Instead, his wife is there, a woman named Jael. And again, we have this kind of cool name thing. Her name means mountain goat. So obviously she was an attractive woman. Maybe not. Jael the mountain goat. Who doesn't want their daughter to be named that? But Jael, she may not be a looker, but she's definitely tough like a mountain goat. And so Sisera comes into her tent and says, hey, can you hide me? Can you hide me? And Jael, either because God's come to her, because she understands how the battle went, and is like, no, I'm not going to side with you. She's like, oh, yeah, sure, come on in. I'll take care of you. Let Mama take care of you. Come on into the mountain goat's tent. Here, crawl under this rug. I'll take care of you. And he's like, stand at the door and don't tell anybody that I'm here. And there's this kind of like, this kind of play on words. He said, say so nobody's here. And she replies, I will definitely tell them that there is no man in my tent. He's like, can I have a drink of water? And so instead of water, she gives him a skin of milk. So basically, if you were a herder at this time, you would take milk and you would store it in a leather bag. And you can imagine what happens to milk when it goes into a leather bag. It curdles, and then it ferments, and it becomes like alcoholic yogurt, because nothing is more refreshing that I can think of than like alcoholic yogurt. But apparently he thought it was good. So she gives him this big skin of alcoholic yogurt. She's like, drink up, buddy, you'll be okay. So he drinks all this. He's like kind of bloated. It's hot, it's bloated, and he's kind of drunk. And okay, I'll go to sleep. And he crawls underneath the blanket and goes to sleep. And then she goes and gets a brass rod. And she doesn't, I want you to imagine this, she doesn't like hit him on the head with the brass rod. She's not like, wham, okay, now you're past that. No. She takes and puts it on his temple and nails him to the ground. I want you to imagine what that looks like to take a brass rod and nail it through two sides of a person's skull. She doesn't just knock him on the head to incapacitate him, she kills him in an incredibly gruesome way. And when Barak arrives, he's shocked to find that this woman, this non-Jew, this shepherdess named Mountain Goat has taken his glory and has left him nothing but shame. See, when we don't trust God, we miss out on the glory of being used by him. God rescued his people, but he gave the glory that should have gone to Barak. He gave it to a shepherd woman. So once again, Israel has broken its covenant with God, and this brokenness is marked by a fallen culture and an upended social order. And we need to understand that when our relationships with God are broken, bad things happen. Our relationships can be broken by abandoning God or not listening to God or not trusting God. But we also need to understand this, that God redeems broken things with broken people. And if you are sitting here having messed up your entire life, having made bad decision after bad decision, you need to understand that God's plan and his will is not dependent on you. You can't screw up his plan. His will unfold with you or without you. He will allow you to be part of it or not. But you need to also understand that he's in the redemption business. In the same way that he will save his people and redeem his people, he will save and redeem you. Barak is a mighty warrior, and yet he's not given the victory. Deborah is a simple woman, and the willingness to be used by God is far more important than strength or qualifications. Jael is a shepherd woman who's not even a Jew. And yet all of these broken, messed up people are used by God in different ways for his own glory to restore his people. You need to understand, guys, that the only thing that disqualifies us for service to God is our lack of faith. It's not our identity. You can be a woman or a man, rich or poor, and still be used by God. Your past mistakes, while they have consequences, they don't disqualify you for service. Think about this. Even though Barak showed a lack of faith and was not given glory, he was still able to lead Israel to defeat all of the rest of the Canaanites. Barak is mentioned in the Hall of Faith in Hebrews as it talks about the men of faith. Barak's lack of faith at the beginning is redeemed at the end. And all of our faith can be redeemed as well. All of our weakness, all of our rebellion, all of these things can pass away. We simply have to be willing to be used by him. Brothers and sisters, we find ourselves at an inflection point in our culture. We have wandered away from the plans that God has made for us. But that doesn't mean that things are too late. Whether it is in your family life, in the life of this church, or in the life of our nation, we can always turn back to God. And so I want to encourage you as we come to our time of invitation, our time of response. I want you to take a moment and just reflect on your life. If there are places in your life where you have failed or you have rebelled against God or you have maybe not gone the way that God's wanted you to go, I want you to know that right now, today, your life can change by simply agreeing to follow him. Maybe you've never made a profession of faith in Christ. You don't know who he is. Well, you can make a profession of faith in Christ today. But it may be more than that. It may be that you've made a profession of Christ, you've decided to follow him, but your family's a mess. Guys, maybe you have never led your family.